yet. So those things mediate their aspirations. In the second picture you see, this man who's a little bit older, he's a family man. He has his 2 children. He has his wife or his girlfriend, but they're together. He has the family unit right there with him. He's in a domestic spirit. So again, he's not trying to mean mug. He's there with his girls, and he's there showing a very different side of himself. So it shows you how these different spaces that we operate in, life stage-wise, whether you're in the public or private sphere, these things are mediating the performances that men put on. They're not fixed categories. They're very malleable. And you adapt to where you're at, at any given time. But this idea of traditional masculinity or patriarchy is tied to certain concepts in the West. It's tied to this idea that men should be strong. It's tied to notions of dominance. And when we say strength, we're talking often of physical strength, but we're talking about, I guess, mental toughness too. And this mental toughness is tied with being emotionally detached. Only feelings that men can show, real men show, is maybe anger. But outside of that, men don't show other feelings because they're going to come off as soft, so we have to be hard. This is sort of traditional patriarchy, traditional masculinity. And you get this type of gender performance where societies have these rigid divisions of labor around gender. Things that we see as men's work, things we see as women's work. Women are in different parts of the workforce now. They constitute half the workforce. But there's still a lot of glass ceilings, and we still see certain positions traditionally assigned to men, and women have a hard time working in those different areas. Even something like education at the college level, women's teaching get a different treatment in response to trying to teach students than men get. They get challenged a lot more often on things that men seem to don't get challenged on. So there's this gender component to how we look at and treat people. There's this sort of social positioning and pecking orders with traditional masculinity. We're always wondering how we stand with things. Our ability to fulfill the 3 P's, be providers, protectors, and procreators, we're constantly measuring ourselves in response to things like that. Are we keeping up with the Joneses in terms of how well we provide for our families and those around us? So we're constantly on sort of display in the public arena. And this sort of impacts, men's sort of gender performance and trying to keep themselves, keep things under wraps, and not showing your emotions. I remember one guy I had talked to during my dissertation research. He worked at a foundry. He was married, he had 5 kids. And when he talked to me about, before he got the job at the foundry, he worked as a gas station attendant. When he first got his wife pregnant the first time, and first couple of kids, he worked as a gas station attendant. So he made minimum wage. They moved on their own, and he's the only one working. So they got a lot of evictions. They got moved around a lot. And he talks about just how humiliating that felt to him, being evicted like that. He said, you feel like you're less than a man, less than a husband, less than a father. He saw it as highly emasculating. So this idea of how we perform those 3 P's, we're not just looking at how society is looking at us, but we're very much looking at ourselves, and we're gauging our own performances. And people think sometimes that, these black men are unfazed by what's going on in their lives. If they're not employed, or the economy doesn't faze them. My research has shown a very different picture. They're very much fazed by these things. They sometimes deal with bouts of depression as they internalize these expectations and feel like they're falling short. But again, that's not something they can talk to, guys in an everyday public setting because they're supposed to keep their feelings under wraps. But that was something that came out in the study with Dr. Misra. A number of men scored pretty high on depression. Men who had, like I said, a more marked relationship with the economy and the workforce that definitely impacted how they saw themselves as men, if they're on an obligation with them to be men. So a lot of men subscribe to patriarchy. I say right up there, males are policed. They're constantly being policed regarding their gender performances, as well as rewarded for their gender performances. So again, men who are able to fulfill those 3 P's, they're rewarded in society. We look up to them. We validate them. Men who don't get called out for it at different levels. They police and call out themselves for it. But we can also ask the question, why do men at times reject this idea of traditional masculinity or patriarchy? Because that happens too. So how do men get away from just completely subscribing to this you have to be strong and hard, and possess these type of qualities? And I think how we look at this picture, how we frame that dynamic is really important. Because when we look at the traditional peace paradigm, and we look at a lot of young men who identify with the streets, and we look at this sort of street corner culture, whether it was the street corner culture from the 60s with Levo, or whether it's the guys that are selling drugs today, when we take that focus, their public gender performances, we're not even taking into context their relationships with domestic spirit. And that, in so many ways, is even driving that. And we don't take into account, I think, enough their relationship to globalization and post-industrialization, how they've been sort of left on the margins. But we look at their individual gender performance, and we somehow say these men are failed men, or they're not living up to their role. But just as I was showing you in the book that we read, Fixed Men, when we had that one chapter from the bedroom to the boardroom, what goes on with globalization has direct impact on the decisions people are making in their everyday lives. But we often think of the individual as being solely responsible for his or her fate. But if you go to a subpar educational system, if you have you live in a city that's has like a 30% unemployment rate, your prospects are very slim, and people still continue to persevere on. But I'm interested in, in spite of these things, what are they doing? How are they still, going on? And what are some, some positive things that they're doing in spite of these things? And they're looking at it and honestly acknowledging what their challenges are, I think is important. But I think if we look at those moments of resiliency, what we're doing in a lot of ways, talking about Black History Month, what we're doing is we're sort of charting our modern-day North Star by showing men who are resilient as opposed to constantly problematizing and saying these guys are only coming from this deficit model. What are the strengths that they're coming to the table with? And that's some of the things I want to talk about. But I'm going to still talk about this idea of performance traditional masculinity for a minute. Again, life stage development very much informs who goes along with this idea of traditional masculinity. We know that young men and adolescents, they're really eager to earn the tacit approval of their male peers who perform traditional masculinity. And again, that's a life stage when you're trying to actually cut your mother's apron string. So I had young men who would tell me things like, you don't listen to your mother at a certain age. You got to be your own man. And by default, sometimes they're dating a young lady. She's on an extension of, she's another female. We don't listen to her because, again, we have to show ourselves as being strongly men. So they took the most stereotypical indexes of manhood at the early life stage development. But even as we talk about that, men I talked to who thought about those things as young men, as they got into committed relationships and developed long-term relationships, they often have these sort of turning points, and they're able to move away from that type of posture, But this idea of women and gender performance, though. Women are essential to men's aspirations in a heterosexual society like we have in America, where heterosexual relationships culminate in marriage is seen as a norm, and they're viewed as a normal progression of one's life course trajectory. So we in American society understand that people are expected often to get married, and if we don't go out and follow that script, somehow that calls, our own sense of who we are into question. Some people push back in response to that. People who are not seen as good marriage material often push back, and they downplay, and they say, I don't need marriage anyway. But that still may be one of those burning issues that's at the back of their minds, because they're not verbally acknowledging that. But some of the narratives they sometimes show that is one of the issues that sort of bothers them. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. We look at these ideas of gender performance for women over time and by different groups. Males initially again see opposite sex as conquest, which reflects their patriarchal disposition at the early life stage. So during adolescence or early adulthood, respondents often talked about, in that statistical research, they talked about things like, in their life history narratives, they gave titles to their life history narratives, like titles like Virgin No More, The Growth and Beginning of Manhood, My Pimp Years. But they saw having sexual relationship with women as being a transformative part that made them men. But at the same time, she was a stepping stone. And there's this sort of simultaneously sort of denigrating females that help you get there as you get there. When men in their earlier years. And I'm arguing that men do this type of gender performance early on because they don't have the means to actually be providers and to be husbands. So they somehow mock the institution of it. And a good parallel to that is the role of the libertine in earlier friends. Libertine, the romanticized bad boys.